Let's define free will as the ability to choose. The choice is not compelled by external factors and is ordered towards a deliberate end. This statement is what makes it free, and this statement is what makes it willed or intended. Here is our position. Human beings have the power of free will. This power applies when we believe that the motive of pleasure conflicts with the motive of moral goodness. We will defend our position with arguments later on. First, let's elaborate on it by talking about behaviors and motives. The behavior of a thing is either compelled by external factors or not compelled by external factors. In other words, all behaviors are either determined or free, no other possibility. Let's further subdivide all free behaviors into those that are ordered towards a deliberate end and those that are not. In other words, all free behaviors are either free-willed or random. Again, no other possibility. Right off the bat, we will discard the possibility of random behavior. A behavior is random if it occurs without reason, and this runs in direct contradiction with the principle of sufficient reason. There is a sufficient reason for everything that exists, including behaviors. Some people may dispute this point. However, randomness is not usually a big point of contention in the context of free will. We will defend this point in a subsequent video on the principle of sufficient reason. For now, let's roll with it. Thus, there are only two possible types of behavior, determined and free-willed. In practice, a determined behavior means that, for a given set of conditions, the same behavior will always occur. And a free-willed behavior means that, for a given set of conditions, there is a choice in the behavior. Now, we should also mention the idea of free will in the context of compatibilism, the belief that free will is compatible with determinism. In contrast, the idea of free will we are defending is called Libertarian Free Will. Under compatibilism, free will means that we are free to choose what we please. But, since what we please is determined, this belief is really no different than determinism. And so, we dismiss this type of behavior as a valid third option. Ultimately, there are only two possible types of behavior, determined and libertarian free-willed, which will simply be referred to as free will in this video. Now, on to motives. As previously shown, a free-willed choice must be ordered towards a deliberate end. Otherwise, we are back to randomness. In other words, the choice has a motive, which is the end goal that is expected from the choice. And this end goal must be believed to be good. Otherwise, it would not count as a motive, and there would not be a sufficient reason to ever choose it. For example, if we have to choose between cake or death, there is hardly a motive to choose the latter. The believed good that serves as motive can be divided into two kinds. Subjective good, which means that the perceived good comes from the subject or observer, and objective good, which means that the perceived good is in fact real. Let's call these believed goods pleasure and moral goodness, respectively. Note that we don't need to defend the existence of objective moral goodness here. Since our motive is based on a believed good and not necessarily a real good, we only need to accept that some people believe in objective moral goodness. Let's elaborate on these two goods. Pleasure means anything that feels good, physically or emotionally. It includes seeking pleasures and comfort, and avoiding pains and discomfort. Moral goodness includes things like justice, duties, including religious duties, treating others as ourselves, and taking care of ourselves. Choosing the motive of pleasure requires no effort. Since it is simply following what we desire, this motive is the path of least resistance. On the other hand, choosing the motive of moral goodness, at the cost of pleasure, is going against the path of least resistance, and thus requires an effort, often called willpower. These two kinds of motives are the only two possible end goals that drive all of our free choices. They may not be the direct end goal of the choice, but they must be the final end goal. For example, we choose to go to work in order to make money which allows us to go on vacation, which we believe will bring us pleasure. Or we choose to go to work in order to make money, which helps to support our family, and we believe this act to be morally good. Thus, all our motives fall under either pleasure or moral goodness. We challenge you to find a single example of a free choice which is not done for either of these two motives as the final end goal. Now, the two types of motive are not necessarily mutually exclusive. A choice may be both pleasurable and morally good. For example, a person may take pleasure in supporting their family. However, in the context of free will, our concern is for the case when the choices have different motives. Because, to reiterate our position, free will applies in cases when we believe that the motive of pleasure conflicts with the motive of moral goodness. In this case, like in cartoons, the motives are often depicted as the dark angel and white angel on our shoulders. Those motives can influence, but not compel. Like advisors of a king, they can inform and even try to persuade. But in the end, the king has the final say. Now, on two examples. Consider the first case example. You plan to treat yourself to ice cream. You can choose between vanilla and chocolate, and you happen to prefer chocolate over vanilla. Thus, vanilla would result in some pleasure, but chocolate would result in more pleasure. All else is equal. In such a case, we observe that we are not free to choose, that we would pick chocolate every time. Try this ice cream thought experiment for yourself. The rule is that, aside from the difference in flavors, all else must be equal, and you cannot add a third motive. We wager that you too will observe that you are not free to choose, and this even if we suppose that we have free will. We explain this result by the fact that the two motives differ in degree, but not in kind. As free will only gives us the ability to choose between different kinds of motive, this case falls outside of its scope. As far as free will is concerned, there is really only one option here, because there is only one kind of motive: pleasure. When two motives differ merely in degree, then the stronger motive wins, and our behavior is in fact determined. This does not mean that we lose our power of free will, but rather, the power is not applicable when pleasure and moral goodness are not conflicting. Now, consider the second case example. You recently obtained extra cash. You have the choice to treat yourself to ice cream or donate the money to a charity. The ice cream choice is motivated by pleasure, the charity choice is motivated by moral goodness. In such a case, we observe that we are free to choose, even when the two motives differ in degree. Try your own thought experiment again. Have pleasure compete with moral goodness, leave all else as equal, and don't add a third motive. We wager that you will observe that you are free to choose every time. Even if we vary the degree for each motive, you may still observe that you have a choice. We explain this result by the fact that the two motives differ not merely in degree, but in kind. Thus, free will, should it exist, allows us to choose freely between kinds of motive, regardless of their degree. A motive with a higher degree may be more influential, which may require more willpower to overcome it, but it still does not compel. Side note, we make an exception for the case of severe health conditions like severe addictions and depressions, where the pleasure and pain may be so strong that they might overcome our willpower in practice. But these are exceptions and not the rule. So far, we have merely described our position on free will. Now, on to arguments to defend its existence. The first and strongest argument is about our common perception of free will. Here is the data. We all perceive that in some cases we have free will. This perception is constant and nearly common to all. Refer back to case example 2 about ice cream and charity. As per the principle of sufficient reason, also known as Occam's razor, the simplest explanation that accounts for all the data is the most reasonable one. If it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, it is reasonable to infer it is a duck. It could also be a robot controlled by the government, but if it is not supported by evidence or arguments, then this explanation is superfluous. The simplest explanation to explain our common perception of free will is that we have free will. Alternative explanations that we have false perceptions of free will are less reasonable. Positing a new explanation, namely that something else is causing the false perception of free will, is possible, but if it is not supported by evidence or arguments, this explanation is superfluous. What about an existing explanation? If an explanation is already established, then it does not need additional support. But there doesn't seem to be any existing explanations that adequately explain the data. Take the theory of evolution, for example. What benefits our species to have a false perception of free will? Therefore, given our common perception of free will, it is reasonable to infer that we have free will. The second argument is about moral responsibility. Responsibility implies freedom of choice. If our moral actions were not free, then we would not be morally responsible for them. And this would be absurd, because we do, in fact, praise and blame people for their moral actions. The word absurd here does not mean ridiculous, but devoid of common sense or counterintuitive. Therefore, it is reasonable to infer that we have free will. Here is an objection. Not everyone agrees with premise 2. Some people accept that, although we are not morally responsible, we can still praise and blame moral actions in order to condition people to live peacefully in society, similar to how we would train dogs to behave a certain way. We respond that, although this non-personal approach may be fitting on a societal level, it still seems absurd not to hold people morally responsible when we know them personally, including ourselves. This argument may be technically weaker than the first because it relies on our common sense or common intuition. However, it may be compelling for people who hold a strong sense of morality. Now, on to arguments against free will and responses. We give 3 counter-arguments, 2 scientific arguments, and 1 philosophical one. The first argument is on scientific experiments. Participants are instructed to perform a simple action, such as pressing a button, at the time of their choosing, while monitoring their brain activities. The results show that brain activities associated with the action occurred before the choice to act was made. In other words, on the timeline, the action of pressing the button is initiated before the conscious choice of pressing the button. Since an effect cannot occur before its cause, it follows that the conscious choice is not the cause of our chosen actions. Therefore, our actions are predictable and determined. We respond that, as described previously, the power of free will is applicable only when the motive of pleasure conflicts with the motive of moral goodness. As these experiments do not include a moral component, there is no conflict, and therefore free will is not applicable. In other words, this experiment falls under case 1. Pleasure versus pleasure. In this case, the act is indeed determined, but it does not follow that we don't have free will. A valid experiment would need to have a motive of pleasure conflicting with a motive of moral goodness, but such an experiment may be challenging to design and may even be unethical. Here is the second argument. There are medical cases where a person's moral behavior changes substantially after a trauma to the brain. Therefore, our choices depend on the functioning of the brain, which in turn depends on external factors. This argument is more relevant to our position because it includes moral actions. We respond that an outcome can depend on many factors, and all the factors must be present for the outcome to occur. Our choices may depend on both the power of free will and the functioning of the brain. For example, in order to be able to speak a language, we must know the language and have a functioning voice. If our voice no longer functions properly, then we can no longer speak the language properly, but we continue to know the language. Likewise, in order to have a free choice, we need both the power of free will and a functioning brain. This is because we must believe that the choices presented have conflicting motives, and brain power is necessary to process information about the choices presented. Thus, if our brain no longer functions properly, then we would no longer be able to make an informed free choice. But that would not change the fact that we have the power of free will. Other necessary factors would include being awake, being sober, believing that there is a moral conflict, and so on. Since the observations in those medical cases fit within the explanation of free will, the conclusion that we do not have free will does not follow. The third and strongest argument is a philosophical one, about the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. Free will is not compatible with the principle of sufficient reason because there must always be a reason, or cause, to explain our actions, including the intended choice. For example, if we intend to choose moral goodness over mere pleasure, then something must have caused this intention, such as our upbringing. As the philosopher Schopenhauer puts it, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. For clarity, let's reformat the argument into syllogisms, that is, by laying it out into its premises and conclusions. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything that exists has a sufficient reason to exist, i.e., a cause, and this includes our choices. A cause is a separate thing from its effect. For example, when object A causes the movement of object B, object A is a separate thing from object B. Therefore, all our choices are caused by external factors. We have defined free will as the ability to choose, and the choice is not compelled by external factors and is ordered towards a deliberate end. Notice how this clause in conclusion 1 is in contradiction with this clause in premise 3. Therefore, free will is not compatible with the principle of sufficient reason and thus cannot exist. Alright, now that the argument is clearly laid out, let's look for errors. There seems to be no ambiguous terms. All the terms are either already clear or clearly defined. There seems to be no logical fallacies. The conclusions follow from the premises. But let's find a false premise. We will reject premise 1. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything that exists has a sufficient reason to exist. This is true, but it does not need to be a cause. The reasons that fulfill the principle can come in many types. The reason can be external, that is, the existence of a thing is explained by a cause. But it can also be internal, that is, the existence of a thing is explained inherently or by definition. Let's give an example. Suppose a painter paints a triangle. Let's inquire why this triangle exists. Because the painter painted it. This is an example of an external reason. The existence of the triangle is explained by a cause. Now, let's inquire why this triangle has 3 sides. Because all triangles have 3 sides. This is an example of an internal reason. A triangle has 3 sides inherently or by its own definition. As long as the existence of the triangle is explained, then the existence of its 3 sides is also explained without the need for additional causes. Thus, not everything that exists has a cause. A thing can also exist inherently. With that, let's go back to the argument. Again, the argument is, free will is not compatible with the principle of sufficient reason because there must always be a reason, or cause, to explain our actions, including the intended choice. We respond that, although there must be a sufficient reason for the intended choice, it does not need to be a cause. The ability to choose without being compelled by external factors is contained in the definition of free will. As long as the existence of free will is explained or confirmed, as defended in arguments 1 and 2, then the intended choice is also explained by the definition of free will. And this internal reason fulfills the principle of sufficient reason. This was a rather lengthy and technical response, but it is saying something that is in fact very simple when using common language. If an object is a triangle, how do we explain that it has 3 sides? Because it is a triangle. That's what triangles are, objects with 3 sides. Likewise, if we were to have the power of free will, how do we explain the ability to choose without being compelled by external factors? Because we have the power of free will. This is precisely what the power is supposed to do. And both explanations are sufficient. In conclusion, Human beings have the power of free will. This power applies when we believe that the motive of pleasure conflicts with the motive of moral goodness. Even when the motives differ in degree, barring a few exceptions, we are still free to choose. In Christianity, these competing motives lead to what is called sin and righteousness, respectively. And the rule to guide our choices, a rather simple rule, at least in theory, is to pick righteousness over sin, to pick moral goodness over pleasure, when the two motives are conflicting. In the next video, we will demonstrate the existence of the soul from free will. See you then, thanks for watching.